The CEO was visiting his ex-girlfriend's grave in silence when he noticed a boy standing beside it. Then the boy turned and said something that hit like lightning. "I think you're my father." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The first raindrop landed on his shoulder like a tentative tap, a small reminder that he stood on hallowed ground. Eric Lockwood, CEO of Lockwood Industries, loosened the collar of his impeccably tailored overcoat and took a few slow steps along the narrow path that snaked through the cemetery's rolling lawns. In the distance, fading sunbeams struggled against the dark clouds gathering overhead, casting the area in a grayish tint. He had come here to honor a memory he could not shake, no matter how many board meetings he attended or how many contracts he signed. The grave he sought lay beneath a solitary willow, its drooping branches shielding the marble stone from the world's hurry. As he approached, the rustling leaves filled his ears with a hush, almost as if nature itself was paying its respects. He paused before the marker, reading the name he had repeated in his mind for years, Margaret Ross. Even now, the pang in his chest at the sight of those letters felt fresh. They had parted under complicated circumstances, moments he regretted. Sometimes he blamed his ambition, sometimes her restless spirit, and sometimes the unstoppable clock that pulled them onto separate paths. Still, not a day passed in which he did not think of her, of what could have been, if only life had allowed. Kneeling, Eric pressed his palm against the cool marble, letting the dampness of the ground soak into his expensive trousers. Material things no longer mattered when he was here. The hush of the cemetery, the weight of her memory. This was a space where all he had built meant little. He set down a small bouquet of calla lilies, her favorite, brushing stray raindrops off the petals. A swirl of old recollections tugged at him, her laugh bouncing off cafe walls in downtown Chicago, her eyes lighting up whenever they strolled by street musicians, the faint perfume she wore that reminded him of summer. How many years had it been? Too many to count on his fingers. Enough for a sense of emptiness to become routine in his daily life. These annual visits offered him a strange solace, like a vow he had made to her, even though she would never respond. Eric closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words hardly audible above the rustling leaves. He had said the same phrase every time he came, as if hoping some cosmic force might carry the apology to wherever she rested. It soothed him, even though it changed nothing. Maybe it was an attempt to bridge the vast distance the two of them had set between each other before she died. He stood about to straighten his coat and head back to the black town car idling beyond the cemetery gates when a slight movement caught his eye. A figure, crouched behind a neighboring gravestone, stood up in a hesitant jerk of motion. At first, Eric thought it was a passerby seeking shelter from the drizzle. But then he saw the boy's face. Maybe 14 or 15, skinny, with hair plastered to his forehead from the dampness. The boy's eyes shifted nervously as though weighing the possibility of flight. Unease prickled in Eric's chest. He had visited this cemetery each year on the same date, and rarely encountered others nearby. Most people offered him privacy, perhaps sensing his solemn intent. Yet this teenager seemed determined to watch him, though not with simple curiosity. There was something else, something guarded and unsure. Eric slipped his hands into his pockets, adopting a gentler posture. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice echoing in the hush. The boy glanced at Margaret's headstone and then looked away as though struggling to find an answer. I'm sorry," he stammered, taking a few steps back. His sneakers scuffed against loose gravel. He clutched something, a small photograph or folded paper, tightly in one hand. "I didn't mean to bother you." Eric studied him with a mixture of caution and concern. "You're not bothering me. It's just unusual to see someone else here." He gestured toward Margaret's grave. Did you know her?" For a beat, the boy's eyes went wide like a startled animal. He swallowed hard, glancing down at the folded paper. Then, in a voice so tremulous Eric almost missed the words, the boy answered, "She was my mom." At first, Eric's mind refused to grasp the statement. He repeated it in his head, "She was my mom," while his heart hammered against his ribs. Margaret had never mentioned having a child. They had been close once, close enough that he believed no secret stood between them. Yet apparently he had been wrong. His breaths turned shallow, the gravity of the situation pressing in. "Your mom?" he echoed, tasting the weight of that revelation. The boy nodded. He was about to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Droplets of rain slid down his cheeks, mingling with tears he tried to hide. Without waiting for further questions, he thrust the folded paper forward. Eric took it, unfolding the damp corners. He immediately recognized Margaret's handwriting, a swirl of elegant lines he had once teased her for, calling it an art form. He scanned the note, half the ink smudged by either time or water. "His name is Jacob. I don't know if I can do this alone, but I must try. Please, if anything happens, let him find the answers he deserves." Eric read it 3 times before lifting his gaze to Jacob. The boy's features, now that the initial shock had passed, bore hints of Margaret's softness. The shape of his eyes, the angle of his jaw, the same slight nose. 1,000 questions rolled in Eric's mind, each one colliding with the next. Had Margaret raised this boy without telling anyone? Where was he living now? Had she told him about Eric at all? He managed only a shaky whisper. "Why were you here? By yourself?" Jacob's shoulders hunched. "I come here every year on this date. Miss Eileen, that was my foster mom, told me about the day my mother died. She said maybe I could talk to her spirit or something. I don't have anyone else." His voice broke at the end like a fragile twig snapping under weight. Eric felt his throat tighten. The thought of Margaret's son living in foster care alone unsettled him more than he could articulate. He took a step forward and the boy reacted with a small flinch. Eric realized he was towering over him in his dark coat, a near stranger. Lowering his voice, he tried to offer calm. "Jacob, He paused. How to explain he had no idea Margaret had a child? How to express that he was stunned, reeling, that everything he knew had shifted in a single moment? "I never met you," Jacob murmured, as though reading Eric's mind. "I saw pictures of a man she used to date. I guess that was you, right? You own that big company I read about?" He sounded uncertain, like he was piecing together truths from shards of rumor. "She had these old photographs, kept hidden in a box. I recognized you from a magazine." Eric felt heat rise to his cheeks, uncertain if it came from shame or sorrow. He nodded slowly, remembering the brief period when he and Margaret had been inseparable. They had only parted ways due to a confluence of misunderstandings and misaligned goals. She had been pregnant when they split? Or had she discovered it later and chosen not to contact him? The ache in his chest flared again. "I don't understand." He cleared his throat, trying to maintain composure. "How did you end up in foster care?" Jacob cast his eyes downward. "My mom got sick. Cancer, I think. We didn't have insurance. We didn't have any money. When she passed, I got placed in a home. I bounced around a bit. Some places were okay, some weren't. But I turned 15 last week." He said it as if every word carried the weight of those lost years. Eric stared at the boy, stunned. 15. Had it really been that long since Margaret left his life? He tried to do the math, but his mind remained in disarray. Regret seeped through him as he wondered if she had been alone in her final days, fighting an impossible battle without anyone to lean on. He remembered her pride, how fiercely independent she was, maybe so independent that she chose to shield him from this entire ordeal. The light drizzle became steadier, droplets glimmering on the edges of the marble headstones. Jacob wrapped his arms around himself, shivering in a threadbare jacket unfit for the weather. Instinctively, Eric shrugged off his own coat, draping it around the boy's narrow shoulders. It was far too large, but it would keep him warm for now. Jacob looked up with startled eyes, an unspoken question on his lips. "Don't worry about me," Eric murmured. "I can handle the cold." A hush passed, the only sound the patter of rain. Eric realized that walking away at this point was impossible. He could not just let the boy vanish, not after learning Margaret had left behind a son. A swirl of protectiveness rose within him, a foreign sensation for someone who had lived single-mindedly for business success. He studied Jacob's uncertain face, and a silent oath formed in his mind. He would not fail Margaret again by ignoring her child. "I don't want to intrude on your life," Jacob said suddenly, as if reading Eric's thoughts. His words poured out in a rush. "I just wanted to see her grave. I'm sorry if I messed up your day." Eric shook his head, forcing a weak smile. "You didn't mess up anything. Believe me, this is something I—" His voice faltered. "I should have known. Margaret and I—" He let the sentence trail off, the bittersweet memory of her flickering like an old film reel in his mind. Jacob glanced at the note again, the page still trembling in his grip. Then he looked at the grave. "I don't have any other family," he repeated more quietly this time. "I didn't know where else to go." The confession splintered the last of Eric's hesitation. He made a decision swiftly and without second-guessing, the way he did when finalizing a multi-million-dollar contract. "Come with me," he said, noticing the boy's wet sneakers and trembling hands. "Let's get you somewhere warm. Then we'll talk, all right?" Jacob's eyes flicked from the grave to Eric, apprehension warring with a faint glimmer of hope. After a tense moment, he nodded. They walked together toward the cemetery exit, the silhouette of Margaret's headstone growing smaller behind them. For years, Eric had lived in the shadow of regret. Regret for not holding on to her, regret for letting his own ambition overshadow everything else. Now he had the chance to do something right, perhaps the only thing that mattered more than any corporate triumph. The question that haunted him was how much damage had already been done and whether he could truly give Jacob the stability he deserved. He paused at the iron gates, letting the boy step out first. The city beyond hummed with horns and distant chatter, indifferent to the silent revelation unfolding here. Margaret was gone, but in her place stood a boy who might have no one else left. Eric set his hand gently on Jacob's shoulder and guided him toward the waiting sedan. "We'll figure this out together," he said. The vow seemed to echo in the drizzle, even as a swirl of anxiety and resolve churned in his gut. In that moment, Eric Lockwood realized that for all his success, none of it mattered if he walked away from Margaret's final legacy. The boy needed someone, and maybe Eric needed to face the ghosts of his own past. One thing was certain: life would never be the same. If you are enjoying this story so far, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Jacob didn't speak much on the drive from the cemetery to Eric's penthouse, where the doorman rushed to open the car door, clearly intrigued by the unexpected presence of a teenager by Eric's side. As they rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, Eric could sense Jacob's apprehension building. The boy's gaze wandered over polished brass panels and mirrored walls, reflecting a world of wealth that must have seemed alien. The penthouse itself was all clean lines and open space, with tall windows overlooking downtown. Jacob lingered near the entrance, shifting awkwardly in his damp sneakers. Everything about him screamed uncertainty, from the tense curve in his shoulders to the fleeting glances he cast around the expansive living room. Not wanting to overwhelm him, Eric cleared his throat. "Would you like something to drink? Water, maybe?" Jacob nodded, so Eric strode to the kitchen area. Normally, he might buzz his housekeeper, but this situation felt too personal to delegate. He retrieved a bottle of water from the fridge, offering it to the boy, who muttered a quiet thanks and took a few tentative sips. For a minute, Eric stood there, mind churning with questions and doubts. Should he call Child Protective Services and explain that he'd encountered Margaret's son? But that felt cold and impersonal, like handing the boy off to faceless bureaucracy. Should he insist on a DNA test right away? The thought of confronting him with medical swabs and official documents so soon felt jarring. Above all else, Eric sensed how fragile Jacob's trust would be. One misstep, and the boy would slip through his fingers, disappearing back into the world that had let him down too many times already. Eric gestured for Jacob to follow him into a smaller den off the main living space. There, a plush sofa faced a modest bookshelf, one of the few spots in the penthouse that felt cozy. Jacob perched on the edge of the couch, knees drawn together. Eric sat opposite him, elbows on his thighs, leaning forward. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" he asked gently. Jacob dropped his gaze. "I ran away from the last foster home. It wasn't good there. Sometimes I sneak back into the old shelter if they don't notice me, but it's full most nights, and He faltered, twisting the water bottle in his hands. "I didn't know where else to go." Eric released a slow breath. "Well," he said, working to keep his voice calm, "I have more than enough room here. You can stay for now, until we figure out what comes next." He expected some protest, but Jacob merely nodded, as though too exhausted to argue. They sat in silence, the hum of city traffic below filling the space between them. Eric considered how surreal all this felt. He had woken that morning believing it would be like any other: breakfast at the corner cafe, a handful of virtual conferences, then a brief trip to place flowers at Margaret's grave. Now everything was different. Eventually he rose. "Let's find you some dry clothes." He led Jacob down a hallway lined with abstract paintings. The boy's eyes flicked over them in silent curiosity. At the far end, Eric opened the door to a rarely used guest room, flipping on the lights to reveal a bed with crisp white linens, a writing desk, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking glittering skyscrapers. "You can stay here," Eric said, turning to study Jacob's face for any sign of unease. Jacob stepped into the room, shoulders tight. He glanced around, absorbing details he'd likely never experienced before: a private bathroom, a neat closet, fresh towels folded on a bench at the foot of the bed. Eric offered him some spare clothing, basics he kept in storage for visiting relatives. They'd be a bit large, but at least they'd be clean and dry. Jacob accepted them without comment, hugging the garments to his chest. Once Jacob disappeared into the bathroom, Eric exhaled and walked back to the living area, pulling out his phone. He typed out a text to an old friend, an attorney he trusted implicitly. "Need legal advice about guardianship. Urgent. Will call tomorrow." He set the phone down, mind spinning. Before he could delve further, he heard the soft pad of footsteps. Jacob emerged wearing the loose-fitting sweats Eric had given him, his hair damp from a quick wash. The faint scent of soap clung to him, and despite the clothes hanging awkwardly on his slight frame, he looked more settled, if only marginally. He lingered at the threshold, uncertain. "Feel better?" Eric asked. Jacob nodded. "Thanks, I really appreciate it." Eric gestured for him to sit at the dining table, then headed to the kitchen. He rummaged through the cupboards, realizing how bare everything was. His personal chef usually handled grocery orders, and Eric relied on takeout or business dinners. But he found enough to whip up a simple meal: pasta with olive oil and a sprinkle of herbs. As it cooked, he noticed Jacob standing in the doorway, watching with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Hope you like spaghetti," Eric said, attempting a smile. I'm not the world's best cook, but I can manage the basics. It's fine, Jacob replied quietly, leaning against the counter. Then, glancing at the marble floors, he took a breath. Did you know about me at all? Like before today? Eric turned down the heat on the stovetop and shook his head. I didn't. I wish I had, but Margaret never told me. He paused, struggling to choose the right words. We ended things before she could share that with me, if she even knew. And after that, we lost contact. I had no idea she was sick or that she'd had a child. I'm sorry. Jacob pressed his lips together, absorbing Eric's sincerity. I used to hope she'd tell me about my dad, he said after a moment, but she never did, just said he wasn't in the picture. Eric felt that familiar sting of regret. So many choices he'd made in his younger years, pulling extra hours at the company, chasing expansions, had left him emotionally distant. Margaret had drifted away, and he never considered she might have tried to protect him from something, or protect herself. I can't change the past, he murmured, lifting the steaming pot and draining the water. But I can try to help you now, if you'll let me. Jacob stared at the floor. I don't have anywhere else. So, yeah. It wasn't exactly a warm acceptance, but Eric understood how someone who'd bounced between foster homes might be wary. He served up 2 plates of pasta at the table, and they ate in halting quiet. The glow from the city lights outside gave the penthouse a hushed atmosphere. Eric asked a few questions. Did Jacob attend school? Did he have hobbies? But each inquiry revealed how disrupted the boy's life had been. He'd missed extended periods of classes thanks to moves and placements, and any interests he once had faded under the stress of survival. When the meal was done, Eric insisted on cleaning up. He motioned Jacob to the sofa where the boy settled, tucking his legs under him. In the kitchen, as Eric rinsed the dishes, he replayed the day's events like a film reel he couldn't quite believe was real. He'd known heartbreak, certainly, but fatherhood, or anything close to it, that was foreign territory. Even so, the longer Jacob stayed in the penthouse, the more determined Eric became to see this through. Perhaps it was guilt, or devotion to Margaret's memory, or a need to finally open himself to something beyond business. Perhaps it was all three. When Eric returned to the living room, he found Jacob tracing the spines of books on a shelf. They were mostly biographies of famous tech entrepreneurs, economic theory texts, and a few novels he'd never quite found time to read. Jacob pulled one out, an old volume of short stories, and flipped through it absently. I like reading, he said. Sometimes it helps me forget where I am. Eric paused, his gaze drifting over the teenager's solemn face. You don't have to forget here, he said quietly. I want this to be a safe place for you. Jacob hesitated, then placed the book back. Why are you doing this? He asked, looking over at Eric with a blend of suspicion and longing. You don't know me. You just found out I'm connected to someone you used to care about. But I'm not your responsibility. Eric shifted, unsure how to articulate the complexity of what he felt. Because I cared about your mother more than I ever admitted, he said, and because you deserve better than what you've had. If Margaret trusted me enough to leave even a hint. He remembered the note, the small slip of handwriting that suggested she'd wanted Jacob to find answers. Then it's the least I can do. Jacob absorbed this, nodding slowly. I don't want pity, he whispered. This isn't pity, Eric replied. It's a second chance, for both of us. Silence settled again. Outside, the rain strengthened, pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows in a steady rhythm. It lulled them into a tentative calm. Eventually, Jacob yawned, blinking heavily, a clear sign of exhaustion. Eric motioned him toward the guest room. You can sleep there tonight, he said, keeping his tone gentle. Tomorrow, we'll figure things out. Jacob murmured thanks, trudged down the hallway and closed the door quietly behind him. Eric stood alone in the living room. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the skyline. His mind buzzed with practicalities. Should he call a lawyer right away? Should he confirm paternity? Or would Jacob see that as a betrayal? And how would Eric handle the inevitable wave of questions from acquaintances and the media once they discovered he was housing a teenager with a claim linking back to Margaret? He wandered over to the window, pressing one hand against the glass. Far below, headlights zigzagged across the dark streets, people caught in their own dramas. He had always believed that success demanded sacrifice, and in chasing that success, he had sacrificed much of his personal life. Now a living piece of Margaret was resting in his guest bed, and Eric couldn't shake the sense that he owed this boy, her boy, something more than a passing gesture. He remembered how Margaret once teased him for building walls around his emotions. "You're too focused on results," she'd say with a laugh. "Sometimes you have to pause and feel." It had irked him at the time, made him defensive, but perhaps she'd been right. He recalled the last words he said to her in a heated argument, words about how relationships were messy and he had no time for messy. It gnawed at him now, the regret thick in his chest. Eventually, he forced himself to get ready for bed, though he doubted sleep would come easily. He lay on top of the sheets in his own room, staring at the ceiling. Faint light seeped through the blinds, and in that half-darkness he remembered the expression on Jacob's face when the boy said, "I don't want pity." There was so much hurt behind those words, so much raw disappointment. But if Eric had to guess, he thought maybe that boy still had hope. Hope that someone would finally stand by him without conditions. And if that was true, perhaps Eric could do something right for once, not just in memory of Margaret, but for the future of a boy who deserved every chance he'd been denied. He turned onto his side, heartbeat unsteady, mind refusing rest. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would begin to set things in motion. Calls needed to be made, professionals consulted. He would do everything to ensure Jacob was safe and had the support he needed, yet what lingered most strongly in his thoughts was the look in the boy's eyes, a mixture of sorrow and longing that refused to fade. In the next room, Margaret's son slept under new sheets in a space he'd never imagined calling home. Eric wanted him to feel secure here, to break the cycle of rejection and abandonment he must have felt for so many years. And so, before drifting off, Eric made a silent promise to Margaret's memory. Whatever ghosts haunted their past, he would stand by Jacob now. He just hoped he was strong enough to keep that promise. If you're finding this story meaningful, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing so we can continue on this journey together. Morning light spilled across the penthouse's sleek floors, revealing every reflective surface in a soft golden glow. Eric woke to the faint aroma of brewing coffee, an unexpected novelty, given that he had no memory of starting the machine. For a moment, he thought his housekeeper might have come early. Then he remembered. Jacob was here. In the hush of early dawn, the boy must have tiptoed into the kitchen, seeking some sense of normalcy in an unfamiliar place. Rising from bed, Eric slipped on a robe and made his way toward the living area. Sure enough, Jacob stood by the kitchen island, staring intently at the coffee maker as if bracing for it to do something dramatic. He wore the same oversized sweatpants from the night before, the drawstring cinched tight at his waist. Sensing Eric's approach, Jacob turned, offering a timid nod by way of greeting. "Morning," Eric said, keeping his voice even and calm. Jacob cleared his throat. Hope you don't mind. I saw the coffee stuff in the cabinet and figured I'd try it. I don't usually drink coffee, but I thought—" He stopped, shrugging in embarrassment. "It's fine," Eric replied. "I'm usually a tea person, but the coffee's there for guests. And you're a guest." Even as he said the word guest, he knew it felt inadequate. Jacob might be here for a night, a week, or longer. The future was suddenly a tangled mess of possibilities. Jacob hovered near the counter. "Do you want some?" he asked, lifting the pot slightly. The coffee hadn't brewed perfectly. There were still some stray grounds floating on the surface, but the gesture was more important than the result. "Sure," Eric smiled. "We'll figure out how to work the machine properly next time." They settled at the dining table, each nursing a mug. Jacob took a tentative sip and cringed at the bitterness. Eric suppressed a grin and handed the boy a sugar bowl. Moments like this, mundane, almost trivial, felt strangely significant. It was as if they were forging a small ritual that anchored them in the same reality. "I have a friend I need to talk to today," Eric said, carefully gauging Jacob's reaction. "She's an attorney who can help me figure out some legal details. I'm not sure how comfortable you are with all of this, but I want to be sure we do things the right way." Jacob avoided Eric's eyes. "You don't have to do any of that," he murmured. "I'm used to taking care of myself." The statement sounded less like defiance and more like a boy trying to minimize a burden. Eric set his coffee aside. "I understand, but let's be clear. You shouldn't have to keep doing everything on your own. If there's a safe path forward, a way to get you settled without the risk of going back into a system you hate, I think we should take it." Jacob shrugged but gave a small nod. "Okay." After breakfast, Eric stepped into his home office, dialing the number he'd texted the night before. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Miriam Barlow speaking. "Miriam, it's Eric," he said, trying to keep any tremor from his tone. "I've got an unusual situation. I need your expertise on custody and guardianship matters." "Certainly," she replied. "Want to give me the short version now and we'll dive deeper later?" Eric inhaled. "A 15-year-old boy turned up at my door. It appears he's the son of someone I used to. Someone who passed away. He's been in foster care. And I want to see if there's a legal avenue for me to care for him. I'm not sure if adoption is the right word, but something that keeps him safe." Miriam was silent for a beat, then with her usual professionalism said, "We can certainly explore guardianship. There are steps, background checks, home evaluations, possibly a paternity test if there's any dispute regarding who's biologically involved. But if you're simply stepping in where no other relative exists, it might be simpler. I'll need more details." Eric's fingers drummed on the desk. "I'll set up a meeting with you in the next few days." "Thanks, Miriam." When he ended the call, he glanced at the living room. Jacob stood near one of the large windows, gazing out at the bustling city below, a reminder of how abruptly his life had changed. Eric pocketed his phone and joined the boy, noticing how Jacob seemed both captivated and intimidated by the view. "Does the height bother you?" Eric asked softly. Jacob shrugged, not turning around. "Not really. It's more like, I never thought I'd see everything from up here. The city looks different." He hesitated, then added, "I used to watch planes pass overhead at night when I was lying on some couch in a foster home or staying in a shelter. I'd wonder if those people in first class had lives that made sense." Eric swallowed, recognizing the poignancy of that statement. "Sometimes even first-class passengers don't have their lives figured out," he admitted. "Money and comfort help, but there's more to having a life that makes sense." Jacob's reflection in the glass flickered, and a ghost of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe." They passed the morning in relative quiet, each adjusting to the presence of the other. Eric's phone buzzed with work messages, questions about contracts, scheduling requests from the board, but he found himself answering in clipped responses, reluctant to disappear into his usual world of non-stop calls. Something about Jacob's vulnerability forced him to slow down, to weigh each moment more carefully. Midway to noon, Eric's phone rang again. This time the display showed a name he hadn't expected, Victor Manning, his CFO. Usually their conversations centered on quarterly earnings or expansions. Eric considered letting it go to voicemail but decided against it. "Eric," Victor said once he picked up, "we have a problem. The figures from the East Coast project are off. The investors want a meeting tomorrow. Apparently they've heard rumors you might be distracted." Eric frowned. Distracted? Where would they get that idea? No clue, Victor sighed. But rumors spread fast. You know how this city operates. Glancing toward the hallway where Jacob had disappeared moments ago, Eric felt a flare of protective concern. He didn't want the media or the corporate sharks sniffing around personal matters. Yet, if he ignored the crisis, everything he'd built could start to crumble. "All right," Eric said at last. "Set up the meeting. I'll be there. But keep a lid on any personal speculation." After hanging up, Eric went to find Jacob, who was flipping through channels on the television. "I need to step out to handle a work situation," Eric said. "Will you be okay here on your own for a while?" Jacob gave a non-committal shrug. "Sure." Realizing the boy might not understand how secure the penthouse was, Eric offered reassurance. "You can call me anytime, or if you need something and can't reach me, there's a security desk downstairs. They know you're staying with me." "Got it." Jacob avoided eye contact, focusing on a black and white rerun. It struck Eric that leaving the boy alone might trigger his fear of abandonment. Stepping closer, he lowered his voice. "Listen, this work stuff, it's urgent, but I promise I'll be back. There's food in the fridge. I won't be gone long." Jacob nodded without comment, turning the volume up a notch. Eric hovered, unsure if he was doing the right thing. In truth, he didn't have many options. He had responsibilities that stretched beyond these walls. Still, an uneasy tension followed him out the door. A few hours later, Eric walked into the glass-walled conference room of Lockwood Industries where Victor and a contingent of concerned investors waited. Laptops and spreadsheets lined the long table. The tension in the air was palpable. The moment Eric entered, everyone stood, some in deference, others in an effort to appear cooperative. Victor clicked a file open on the big screen, showing a set of numbers that looked bleaker than Eric had anticipated. A hush fell over the room. One investor, a stern-faced woman in a pinstriped suit, wasted no time in launching into her concerns. "Mr. Lockwood, we've heard rumors that your focus has shifted. We need to be sure that any personal distractions aren't jeopardizing the East Coast deal." Eric clenched his jaw. "My personal life is not an issue. The East Coast deal is secure. We've hit a few snags with local permits, but we have a path forward. I'm fully committed to resolving those." He glanced at Victor, who gave a subtle nod. The meeting stretched on with demands for updated projections, risk assessments, and clarifications. Eric navigated each question as smoothly as ever, though inside he felt a new stirring of impatience. This used to be his element, a high-stakes environment that thrilled him. Now, with Jacob waiting at home, it all seemed less critical. Yes, these numbers mattered, but they weren't everything. When the session finally ended, the investors filed out, apparently placated by Eric's assurances. Victor stayed behind, his expression relieved. "Thanks for handling that. You know how they get. Nerves run high with large sums on the line." Eric ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I understand, but do me a favor. Let's keep any rumors about my personal situation locked down. I don't want external pressure." Victor gave him a thoughtful look. "Are things all right, Eric?" Eric hesitated. He trusted Victor more than most, but the story of Jacob was too new, too personal. "I have some unexpected responsibilities," he said at last, "but I'm managing." Victor merely nodded, gathering up his files. "If you need anything, just say so. I've got your back." With that, Eric headed out, relief washing over him at the thought of returning to the penthouse. Traffic snarled and late afternoon congestion compounding his sense of urgency. By the time he unlocked his front door, dusk was already falling. He found Jacob in the den, curled on the sofa with a blanket draped around him. A half-eaten sandwich rested on the coffee table. The television was muted, the screen casting flickers of color across Jacob's distant gaze. "How was everything?" Eric ventured. Jacob shrugged. "Fine, just quiet." Eric felt his chest tighten, imagining the boy alone for hours, no real sense of belonging. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said. Jacob's response was soft, almost inaudible. "It's not your fault." Eric sank into the armchair opposite him. Outside, the skyline glowed with city lights. He realized now that building trust with Jacob would be a process, not an overnight fix. But at least they had made a start. "I spoke with my lawyer," Eric continued gently. "We're going to figure out what it'll take for you to stay here safely without bouncing back to foster care. I'd like that if you're comfortable." Jacob fiddled with the blanket's edge. His expression was a swirl of relief and apprehension. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I'd like that too." They let the simple statement rest, a small but significant step forward. Eventually, Eric stood, suggesting they order dinner. Jacob perked up at the mention of takeout pizza, and for a fleeting second, Eric glimpsed the teenager he might have been under kinder circumstances, someone who could enjoy the little things. Later, they ate slices of pepperoni pie straight from the box, a meal that tasted of new beginnings. Neither had all the answers, but a fragile optimism threaded between them. As they finished up, Eric found himself thinking back to Margaret again, remembering how she used to say that no one's destiny was set in stone. People always had room to change, to become something better. Perhaps that was true for both Eric Lockwood and Jacob Ross. Thank you for reading this chapter. If you're enjoying the story, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The next morning dawned with a sky the color of steel, low-hanging clouds threatening to turn the city's usual hustle into a scramble beneath umbrellas. Eric woke earlier than usual, mind already churning with tasks he'd never had to handle before. He'd barely opened his eyes when he thought of Jacob. Was the boy sleeping well? Would he want breakfast right away? Did he even eat breakfast on a regular schedule before landing here? The faint rumble of footsteps reached his ears. Throwing on a light sweater, he ventured out of his room to find Jacob at the kitchen table, flipping through an old newspaper. The boy looked up, half smiling in greeting. His hair stuck out at odd angles, and he wore the same borrowed sweatpants as the night before, plus a fresh t-shirt that hung on him like a sail. "Morning," Eric said, testing the temperature of the situation. Jacob set the newspaper down. "Morning. I was just looking at the headlines. Your company's name shows up a lot." Eric nodded, mildly uneasy. "We're in expansion mode, so the business pages follow us. Anything interesting?" Jacob shrugged. "They wrote about your new contract in Europe. Some speculation about a partnership. Looks pretty high stakes." Eric leaned against the counter. "It is, but I'm confident we'll pull it off." He hesitated, uncertain how to discuss his professional life without sounding distant. "You can ask me questions if you want about the company or anything." Jacob toyed with the newspaper's corner. "Maybe later." They prepared breakfast together, rummaging through the fridge to find eggs and bread. Jacob offered to scramble the eggs, and Eric tried not to hover. Watching the boy break shells and whisk yolks, Eric realized with a small pang that these everyday tasks must have been random chores Jacob picked up from living in foster homes. Each flick of the whisk looked methodical, as though he'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than enjoyment. While they ate, Eric's phone chimed. He glanced at the screen and saw Miriam's name. "Excuse me," he murmured, stepping away to answer. Miriam's voice crackled through. I've set up a meeting at my office tomorrow, she said, skipping formalities. We'll discuss the best route for guardianship. Possibly a temporary arrangement first, then something permanent if that's what you both want. But the paperwork can get tricky, especially if there's any challenge. Eric's gaze flickered to where Jacob now picked at his eggs. Challenge from whom? It's unlikely, Miriam replied, unless another relative appears. But we should be prepared. I'll need any documents relating to his mother's passing and Jacob's time in foster care. Understood, Eric said, keeping his voice low. I'll get whatever I can. After he hung up, he returned to the table. Jacob had abandoned his fork, though his plate was half full. Everything okay? The boy asked. Eric forced a reassuring tone. Yes, that was my friend I told you about, the attorney. We have an appointment tomorrow. I'd like you to come if you feel comfortable. Jacob nodded slowly, not quite making eye contact. Yeah, sure. I guess I should be there if it's about me. Eric wanted to offer some comforting remark but couldn't find the right words. Instead, he cleared plates and suggested they watch a documentary or read something, anything to pass the time until lunch. Yet underneath the quiet, he sensed a growing tension in Jacob. Something flickered in the boy's eyes, a restlessness that said he wasn't used to staying in one place without consequences. By midday, the clouds overhead released a gentle drizzle. The city's skyscrapers vanished behind a pale gray curtain. Eric stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone in hand, scanning messages from Lockwood Industries. He had intended to work from home, but each message reminded him of the high-stakes contract negotiations that wouldn't wait forever. He also worried about leaving Jacob alone again, though. The memory of the boy's lonely figure on the couch the previous day still pricked at his conscience. Sensing Eric's turmoil, Jacob wandered over. You can go to work if you need, he offered in a subdued voice. I'll be fine. Eric turned, surprised by the thoughtfulness. Thanks, but I'd rather stick around today unless something critical happens. I want to make sure we have time to talk before tomorrow's meeting. Jacob bobbed his head. Okay. They spent the next few hours in a tentative routine, each trying not to intrude on the other's space. Eric answered a handful of urgent calls while Jacob flipped through channels or stared at the rain-splattered windows. At one point, Eric suggested they order lunch from a nearby deli, which prompted a small, grateful smile from Jacob. A short time later, the doorbell rang. Eric assumed it was the food delivery, but when he checked the monitor, he saw a familiar figure, his cousin Patricia, the only family member who bothered to check on him unannounced. She wore a bright red raincoat and balanced a large umbrella. Her expression looked curious, maybe a bit alarmed. Eric buzzed her in. Moments later, she stepped into the foyer, water droplets rolling off her coat onto the polished floor. I tried calling, she said, eyebrows lifting. You never replied, so I decided to swing by and make sure you hadn't locked yourself away forever. Eric forced a casual laugh. You know how it is, busy times, come in. Patricia took a few steps, then froze. Jacob stood at the edge of the living area, eyes wide. For a brief moment, the two regarded each other in mute confusion. Patricia turned back to Eric, her gaze demanding an explanation. This is Jacob, Eric said carefully. He's staying with me for a while. Jacob, this is Patricia, my cousin. Patricia, ever the social butterfly, quickly recovered. She extended a hand. Nice to meet you, Jacob. Jacob shook her hand a bit stiffly. Hi. Eric led Patricia to the sofa, gesturing for Jacob to join them if he wished. The boy perched on a nearby armchair instead, as though ready to retreat if things got uncomfortable. Patricia's eyes darted between them, her curiosity thinly veiled. How on earth? She began, then caught herself. I mean, is everything okay? Eric exhaled. It's a long story, Jacob is Margaret Ross's son. Do you remember Margaret? Patricia's mouth fell open slightly. Of course I remember her. I didn't know she had a child, though. She glanced at Jacob with a softened expression. My condolences. I heard Margaret passed years ago. She was lovely. Jacob nodded silently, gaze fixed on his feet. Patricia directed a questioning look at Eric, but he simply shook his head, signaling not to press for details right now. He's here because foster care wasn't working out, Eric said, keeping his tone careful. I'm hoping to become his guardian, but we have some legal hurdles. Patricia, to her credit, did not unleash a barrage of prying questions. She placed a gentle hand on Eric's arm. If you need help, let me know. I'm pretty good at navigating social services red tape. She turned to Jacob. And if you ever want to get away from all these tall buildings, my place in the suburbs is quiet. There's a dog, too. Jacob gave a fleeting half-smile. Thanks, he murmured. The tension in the room eased a fraction. With Patricia's arrival, the penthouse no longer felt quite so hushed. She slid off her damp coat and Eric offered to hang it up. Jacob excused himself briefly to the guest room, perhaps needing a moment to breathe. While he was gone, Patricia leaned closer to Eric, voice low. Eric, are you sure you're ready for this? Taking in a teenager is a huge responsibility, especially one with, she hesitated, a complicated past. Eric's chest tightened. I'm not completely sure, but it feels right. I owe Margaret that much, and Jacob needs someone who won't give up on him. Patricia studied him, her expression a mix of admiration and worry. You've always been self-sufficient, just remember it's okay to lean on others now. This isn't a business deal, it's a life. He nodded, touched by her concern. Then, as he saw Jacob re-emerge from the hallway, Eric straightened and forced a smile. Good, Patricia said more brightly, returning to a neutral topic. Do you mind if I stay for lunch? I'd love to get to know Jacob a bit, if that's all right. Jacob glanced at Eric, seemingly unsure if he had a say. Eric nodded, and Jacob gave a small shrug of acceptance. Sure, the boy said, almost under his breath. They ate sandwiches from the deli, with Patricia doing most of the talking, sharing anecdotes from her college days, describing her dog's antics, occasionally teasing Eric about his workaholic tendencies. Jacob listened, occasionally smiling at her lively tone, though he mostly responded with short phrases or nods. Eric noticed how the boy would flick his gaze toward him whenever Patricia mentioned Margaret, as though gauging his reaction. When the meal ended, Patricia patted Jacob's shoulder in an almost maternal gesture. I'm in your corner, kid, she said. If you need anything, you can count on me. Eric's family is my family. Jacob's cheeks colored slightly, and Eric suspected the boy was unaccustomed to offers of support from people he'd just met. Patricia gathered her belongings soon afterward, donning her raincoat and umbrella once more. Eric accompanied her to the door, where she paused. You look different, she whispered. Maybe you found something that matters more than spreadsheets. Eric had no ready reply, so he simply clasped her hand in thanks. After she left, he lingered by the door, soaking in the odd quiet that followed her departure. When he turned around, he found Jacob in the living room again, watching him with an unreadable expression. Your cousin seems nice, the boy said almost cautiously. No weird vibe or anything. Eric chuckled, a surprising burst of genuine humor. That's Patricia for you. She's all heart. Jacob nodded, then tugged at the hem of his t-shirt. So, tomorrow, we see that lawyer, right? Yes, Eric confirmed, crossing the room. It's nothing scary. She just needs to understand your situation fully. Then we can figure out guardianship or any other steps necessary. Jacob pressed his lips together. I don't really know what to say to a lawyer. I guess I just tell her the truth, right? About where I've been. Eric gently laid a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tension thrumming beneath the surface. "Yes, that's all you need to do. I'll be there with you." Jacob let out a breath. "All right." They spent the rest of the afternoon in relative peace, each in their own corner of the penthouse. Eric made a few calls to gather the documents Miriam needed, the paperwork from Margaret's funeral, any records referencing Jacob's foster placements, and the spare items Jacob had kept in a worn folder, medical records, an old birth certificate with Margaret's name but no father listed. The stark emptiness of that box for father's information reminded Eric of just how much Jacob had been missing. By evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the city streets glistening under lampposts. Eric offered to cook a simple stir-fry, trying to replicate a recipe he'd once seen in a magazine. Jacob joined him in the kitchen, awkwardly chopping vegetables. They exchanged a few jokes about Eric's questionable knife skills. When the food was done, they ate near the windows, gazing out at the skyline. There was a gentle feeling in the air, a shared recognition that they were both learning a new kind of normal. Every so often, Jacob would glance at Eric, or Eric would glance at Jacob, as though each wanted to confirm the other was still present. And this newfound sense of togetherness wasn't a dream. Later, as night wrapped the city in darkness, Eric felt a quiet resolve set in. Tomorrow's meeting with Miriam would mark the first formal step toward giving Jacob a stable future. Legalities could be daunting, but Eric refused to let bureaucracy stand between him and the promise he'd made to Margaret's memory. He looked at Jacob across the living room, the teenager engrossed in some documentary about space travel, eyes bright with curiosity. Maybe, Eric thought, they were both on a journey into uncharted territory, hoping to land somewhere they could finally call home. If you're enjoying this journey, please like, share, and subscribe. Early the next morning, Eric and Jacob descended to the lobby in cautious silence. Outside, a crisp wind blew against the revolving doors, and Eric angled his body slightly to shield Jacob from the chill. They'd agreed to meet Miriam Barlow, Eric's attorney, in her downtown office for a thorough discussion on guardianship. Despite the brightening sky overhead, a certain heaviness lingered in the air, as if both of them sensed the weight of this appointment. Inside the waiting car, Jacob remained quiet, peering out the window at the blur of commuters. He clutched a thin folder containing the documents he'd collected, a tattered birth certificate, a few worn medical records, and other bits of paperwork from his years in foster care. Eric noticed how tightly the boy's fingers gripped the edges, as though he feared the folder might dissolve in his hands. Sliding into the seat beside him, Eric offered a gentle nod, silently conveying that they were in this together. When they reached Miriam's office, a tall stone building wrapped with reflective glass, they proceeded to a small lobby where a friendly receptionist directed them up 2 floors. Jacob's foot tapped an uneven rhythm as they took the elevator. He seemed to brace himself against the mirrored walls, jaw clenched. Eric remembered how terrifying these formal settings could feel to someone used to living with constant uncertainty. Miriam greeted them in the hallway with a warm smile, her short auburn hair framing perceptive eyes. "Jacob, I'm so glad you came," she said, guiding them into a tastefully decorated conference room. Its window overlooked a busy street, and the muted bustle of cars and pedestrians provided a soft backdrop of noise. Miriam gestured toward a round table with several chairs. "Sit wherever you like." Jacob chose a seat a bit off to the side, as if he wanted to keep the exit in sight. Eric positioned himself close enough to offer support, but not so close that Jacob felt crowded. Miriam settled opposite them, opening a neat binder and flipping to a blank page. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "So," she began, "today is just about understanding your situation, both of you. I'll collect details, then explain what legal avenues we have for guardianship or adoption. depending on what you want. Jacob glanced at Eric, eyes uneasy, and then back to Miriam. I don't know much about the law, he admitted, voice quieter than usual. I just know I don't want to go back into foster care. If Eric wants me around, I'm fine staying with him. Miriam's gaze flicked to Eric, measuring his reaction. He nodded. I do want you around, he said, determined to clear any doubt. And I'm prepared to meet whatever requirements are needed. Excellent, Miriam replied, making a note in her binder. Let's start with some background, Jacob. How long were you in foster care? Jacob shifted in his chair. About 4 years. Before that, my mom and I moved a lot. She got sick, so we ended up in these cheap apartments. After she died, they put me in the system. I've been in 3 different placements since. Miriam's brow furrowed, but she remained professional. And there are no other known relatives, correct? No grandparents or aunts and uncles you've been in contact with? He shook his head. No one. A moment of silence followed, underscored by the muffled honk of a taxi far below. Jacob inhaled shakily. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that if I go back, they'll just bounce me to another home. The last couple were rough. Eric clenched his fists under the table, battling the anger that rose whenever he imagined what the boy must have endured. Miriam nodded sympathetically. I see. Well, if Eric is willing to step in, that's often considered a strong option, particularly for a teenager who's already had a traumatic run in the foster system. The courts typically look favorably on a stable environment with someone who can provide consistent care. Jacob's gaze flicked toward Eric again, his eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. Miriam continued briskly. We'll need to file a petition in family court for Eric to become your legal guardian. That will involve some paperwork. Background checks on Eric, verification of your living arrangements, and likely a meeting with a social worker who will make recommendations to the court. If all goes smoothly, a judge could grant guardianship. Eric offered a tight smile. That's what I'd like to pursue. He glanced at Jacob. I just don't want you to feel you have no say. You do. Jacob swallowed, his voice catching slightly. No, I want this. You're the first person who's even tried to help. Very well, Miriam said, tapping her pen thoughtfully. Jacob, one more thing. Has there ever been any claim from a biological father? Or any indication he might want to contest guardianship? Jacob tensed, and Eric felt the air sharpen. He'd avoided pressing the question of Jacob's father, not wanting to dredge up pain or confusion. Miriam, however, needed clarity. After a taut pause, Jacob answered, There's no name on my birth certificate. My mom never told me anything. I don't think there's anyone to claim me. Miriam frowned. Understood. If by some chance a person appears in the future, we'd deal with it then. But right now it appears that's not a concern. Jacob nodded, then released a breath he seemed to have been holding. They spent the next hour going through more details. Miriam asked about schooling. Jacob admitted he was behind, though he wanted to catch up, and about medical care. Eric promised to help arrange a checkup and handle any insurance issues. Finally, Miriam handed Jacob a small stack of forms to sign, explaining each in simple terms. You'll get a hearing date, she concluded, but that's mostly a formality if everything else is in order. In the meantime, you can stay with Eric under his supervision. No one should force you back into foster care if we file the paperwork promptly. A faint smile touched Jacob's lips. Thank you, he said, voice steady yet full of emotion. With that, they wrapped up. Miriam shook their hands, promising to expedite the documents. She asked Jacob to keep in touch, particularly if he remembered any detail about relatives that might complicate the process. He agreed, though the subdued tension in his posture suggested he wanted to close the chapter on his past. Outside, the day felt lighter, the sky more open as they emerged from the building. Eric guided Jacob into the car, noticing how the boy's shoulders no longer seemed as hunched. Once they were on the road, Eric decided they deserved a small celebration. "How about lunch somewhere special?" he proposed, catching Jacob's gaze in the rearview mirror. "Anywhere you like." Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm not picky. Maybe just a burger place." Eric smiled, recalling that fancy restaurants might be intimidating. "A burger place it is." He directed the driver toward a well-reviewed diner he occasionally passed on his commute. When they arrived, the neon sign in the window flickered welcome. They slipped into a booth near the back, the vinyl seats squeaking as they settled. The menu featured a wide range of classic American comfort food. Jacob scanned it with the intensity of someone who rarely got to choose. Eventually, he settled on a bacon cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake. Eric chose something similar, enjoying the novelty of sitting in a modest diner with a boy who was, by all appearances, rapidly becoming the central figure in his life. "So," Eric ventured once the waitress left with their orders, "how do you feel about what happened today?" Jacob picked at a corner of a napkin. "It's a relief," he admitted. "I mean, I'm still worried something could go wrong, but Miriam seems like she knows her stuff." "She's one of the best," Eric assured him. "She wouldn't have taken this on if she didn't think it was winnable. Plus, I'll do everything in my power to give you the home you deserve." Jacob nodded, swallowing. I never thought I'd be sitting in a diner talking about guardianship with a man who runs a giant company and used to know my mom." He managed a small laugh, as though baffled by fate. "Life is weird." Eric found himself smiling in genuine camaraderie. "Life is definitely weird, but maybe it's bringing us where we need to be." Their food arrived and conversation halted briefly as they devoured the burgers. Jacob's eyes widened at the first bite. "So good," he said around a mouthful, wiping stray ketchup with a napkin. Eric suppressed a laugh, delighted by the boy's honest enthusiasm. Through the window, the city churned with its usual midday rush: delivery trucks, cyclists, pedestrians scurrying to lunch breaks. Yet inside their little booth, the world felt momentarily calm. After they finished, Eric paid the check, leaving a generous tip. Jacob insisted on carrying the to-go box that contained half of his leftover fries, apparently not wanting to waste them. As they headed back to the car, the sun finally broke through the clouds, a sharp ray glinting against tall buildings. The driver held the door open, and they slid onto the cool leather seats. "Where to now?" asked the driver. Eric considered. They could go straight home, but a thought struck him. "Jacob, would you mind taking a quick detour? I need to show you something." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Sure, I guess." Eric gave the driver directions, and they soon found themselves winding past rows of old brownstones, the city's polished glass towers slowly receding. Eventually, the car stopped before a nondescript building with a modest sign, Harbor Light Community Center. This was a place Eric had helped fund some years back, a quiet contribution intended to provide tutoring and after-school programs for underprivileged youth. He led Jacob inside, greeting a volunteer by name. The large room was filled with tables, whiteboards, and shelves lined with books. A handful of teenagers sat in clusters, working on homework or chatting. Jacob hovered near the entrance, uncertain, while Eric explained to a staff member that he wanted to introduce a potential student. The woman, a middle-aged volunteer named Clara, beamed at Jacob. "You're more than welcome to come by," she said, handing him a small flyer. "We have tutoring most afternoons, plus we do weekend study sessions. No charge. It's a safe space to catch up on whatever subjects you want." Jacob's fingers brushed the edges of the flyer. "Really?" "Absolutely," Clara replied, brightening further. "We also have a rec room downstairs. Ping-pong table, board games. People here look out for each other." Jacob scanned the bustling scene, his expression torn between interest and apprehension. Eric gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "No pressure," he said softly. "But if you ever want to fill in gaps in your schooling, or just be around kids your age in a supportive place, this is an option." Miriam mentioned the importance of stable academics, so I thought maybe this could help. Jacob cleared his throat. "Thanks. I'll think about it." They said their goodbyes and stepped back out into the brightening day. Eric breathed in the cool air, hoping the short visit showed Jacob that stability could exist outside the walls of the penthouse. He wanted to arm the boy with opportunities, not just a safe bed. Back in the car, Jacob rested the flyer on his lap, tracing the printed phone number with a fingertip. His gaze lingered on the passing streets, a swirl of caution and yearning behind his eyes. Eric studied the boy's thoughtful posture. Perhaps the concept of planning a future, of imagining something beyond mere survival, was foreign to him. Yet the hint of possibility was there, blossoming in small increments. When they finally arrived home, the afternoon sun streamed through the lobby windows. They rode the elevator up in an easy quiet. Once inside the penthouse, Jacob set his leftover fries on the counter and tossed the flyer onto the table. Then he turned to Eric, face solemn. "Thanks," he said, voice low, "for all this. The lawyer, the burger, that center. Just thank you." Eric's heart twisted, touched by the fragile sincerity. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I want to do it." Jacob nodded, looking around the penthouse as though seeing it with fresh eyes. "You know, I used to tell myself I'd never trust another adult, but you're—" He trailed off, his cheeks turning pink. Eric offered a gentle smile. "I hope I'm proving you wrong." Jacob shrugged, a corner of his mouth lifting in a faint grin. "You're doing okay so far." They stood there, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them. Beyond the windows, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the quiet evolution unfolding in this high-rise sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, paperwork, formalities, perhaps new layers of emotion. But for now, the day's victories felt significant. They were forging a path forward, one small step at a time, navigating the delicate terrain between strangers and family. If you're moved by this story, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Slivers of early sunlight crept around the edges of the blinds, painting the penthouse walls in pale gold. Eric stirred, blinking at the digital clock on his bedside table. It was just past 6, earlier than he usually rose. Yet despite his lingering fatigue, he felt an odd sense of anticipation coursing through him. Yesterday's meeting with Miriam had gone well, better in fact than he could have hoped. They'd laid the foundation for guardianship, and Jacob had returned home with a tenuous sort of relief etched across his face. Perhaps this morning would bring more signs of calm, a steadying rhythm in their new life together. He found Jacob already awake, perched on a stool at the kitchen island. The boy was halfway through a glass of orange juice, feet dangling as though he wasn't quite sure where to plant them. Their eyes met with a brief, wordless acknowledgement. Neither one seemed eager to break the hush. Eventually, Eric ventured a greeting, voice still rough from sleep. Jacob managed a tiny nod before sipping his juice again. Despite the quiet, something about the boy's posture suggested less apprehension than before, as if he were growing more comfortable in this airy, high-rise world. Eric set about making toast. He realized he'd grown oddly protective of these simple routines, moments he would once have disregarded in favor of an early business call or a quick dash to the gym. Now, every small gesture felt loaded with meaning, the act of opening the fridge, asking Jacob if he wanted any fruit, or casually reminding him about the community center. All of it carried an unspoken promise that Eric intended to keep, that Jacob would not be alone if he didn't want to be. After breakfast, They stood by the living room window, letting the morning brightness wash over them. Cars and buses crawled along the streets below, and the faint roar of traffic seeped through the glass. Jacob broke the silence first. "Do you have a busy day?" he asked, voice subdued. Eric nodded. "A few important meetings at the office, but I'll be home by mid-afternoon." He studied the boy's expression. "If you want, you can come with me, get a sense of what I do." Jacob blinked in surprise. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" Eric suppressed a smile. "Of course not. I'd rather you see it all for yourself. Might be boring, though, lots of spreadsheets and phone calls." A flicker of curiosity lit Jacob's eyes. "I don't mind. I'd like to know more about your world." He paused, glancing down as though uncertain he'd said too much. Then he added, "I've never actually seen the inside of a corporate office." Eric's chest warmed with a faint pride. "Then let's go. We'll stop by a clothing store first so you can get something more comfortable, maybe a few outfits. I'm sure we can spare an hour for that." They headed downstairs, where Eric's driver pulled the sedan up to the curb. The ride across town felt different from the day before, less tense, more open-ended. When they reached a small boutique known for practical, age-appropriate styles, Eric ushered Jacob inside. A young sales associate greeted them, guiding Jacob toward racks of jeans, sweatshirts, and t-shirts. Initially, the boy hovered near Eric, shy about choosing items. But as he began to thumb through the hangers, he relaxed. He picked out a simple gray hoodie, dark wash jeans, and a pair of sneakers with a splash of color on the sides. Standing at the register, Jacob watched wide-eyed as Eric handed over his credit card. "You don't have to buy me all this stuff," the boy mumbled, cheeks coloring. "I'd manage with less." Eric met his gaze, voice gentle. "Jacob, it's all right. Consider it part of starting fresh." He didn't add that he saw these purchases as a necessary investment in Jacob's self-confidence, a chance for the teenager to feel he belonged in the world rather than hovering on its margins. A short while later, they emerged onto the bustling sidewalk, bags in hand. Jacob wore one of his new t-shirts under the fresh hoodie, looking at once grateful and overwhelmed. Soon they slipped back into the car and continued toward Lockwood Industries, the main building looming on the horizon like a gleaming testament to Eric's years of ambition. As they pulled into the underground parking, Jacob's eyes followed the sleek architecture, the tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Inside the lobby, men and women in tailored suits crisscrossed the marble floor, carrying laptops or tapping on phones. The instant they noticed Eric, many stepped aside to offer greetings, some openly curious about the teenager at his side. Jacob kept close, not so much out of fear, but more out of uncertainty at how to navigate this polished world. Eric offered a confident nod to each passing employee, steering Jacob toward the executive elevator. On the ride up, Jacob leaned against the brushed steel walls, absorbing the hush. "It's so different," he said quietly, scanning the overhead lights. "Everyone seems to know you." Eric gave a small shrug. "I am the CEO, after all, but it's just a title. The real work is meeting after meeting, balancing budgets, trying not to let things fall apart." Jacob tilted his head, as though seeing Eric in a new light. "That's what you're worried about? Things falling apart?" "Aren't we all?" Eric murmured, tapping his fingers on the rail. "I just have a lot of people relying on me to keep this company running smoothly." At the top floor, the doors slid open to reveal a reception area with glass partitions and modern artwork. Eric's assistant, Dana, stood behind a curved desk, flashing a practiced smile. "Morning, Mr. Lockwood," she said, then gave Jacob a curious but friendly glance. "Welcome. I'll bring coffee in if you'd like, or water." Jacob glanced at Eric, unsure, but Eric simply nodded. Water would be great. Dana disappeared into a side room, and Eric guided Jacob through the open-plan office. Staffers paused their work to observe the newcomer. Some recognized him from tabloid rumors. They'd heard whispers of Eric harboring a mysterious teen, though no one dared gossip aloud. Others appeared genuinely welcoming, offering half waves and quick smiles. Jacob, shoulders tense, nodded back stiffly. Soon they entered Eric's personal office, a space defined by a panoramic view of the skyline and a long walnut desk free of clutter. A pair of minimalist black chairs faced the desk, and a leather sofa lined one wall. Jacob approached the tall windows, pressed a hand gently against the glass, and stared at the sprawl of buildings below. "You can see everything from here," he breathed. Eric took off his jacket, draping it on the back of a chair. "It's a good vantage point, but it can be misleading," he said. "Seeing everything from so high makes it feel like you're in control, even if you aren't." Jacob nodded, still transfixed by the view. Dana reappeared, setting down a bottle of water on the desk for Jacob, along with a coffee for Eric. Then she handed Eric a small folder. "These are the updated projections for the East Coast project," she explained, stepping back politely before retreating into the hallway. Eric flipped through the folder, eyebrows knitting as he scanned the figures. Looks like some costs have gone up. I'll have to address that in the next meeting." Setting it aside, he turned to Jacob. "You can hang out here while I take a few calls, or if you like, you can walk around. There's a lounge area down the corridor." Jacob shrugged, stepping away from the glass. "I'll stay. I kind of want to see how you do things." Eric tried to mask his amusement. "Fair enough. Just don't be startled if it gets dull." Over the next hour, Eric settled behind his desk, conducting a series of phone conferences on speaker mode. Jacob sat in one of the black chairs, quietly observing. An occasional flicker of curiosity crossed his face whenever the conversation turned to budget approvals or negotiations with potential partners. Though the language sometimes strayed into corporate jargon, Jacob seemed oddly attentive, as if hungry to learn. When the last call ended, Jacob asked, "So, these people you're talking to, they expect you to fix everything for them?" Eric rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "In a sense, yes. They look to me for decisions that can mean big wins or huge losses. I try to keep them calm, keep the money flowing. It's a dance." Jacob drummed his fingers on the edge of the chair. "And do you like it?" The question struck Eric as both simple and profound. He glanced at the scattered reports on his desk, then at the silhouette of the city beyond the windows. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I like that I built something, gave people jobs, created opportunities. But it's also lonely. There's a lot of pressure to be strong and sure all the time. You can lose sight of yourself if you're not careful." Jacob looked thoughtful, as though that answer resonated more than he'd expected. Before he could respond, Dana's voice crackled through an intercom. "Mr. Lockwood, your team for the East Coast expansion is here. Shall I show them to the conference room?" Eric pressed the button. "Yes, thank you. I'll be right there." He stood, smoothing his tie. "You can come, or you can stay here and read. Promise this part might be extra boring." Jacob stood too, squaring his shoulders. "I'll come. I want to see everything." In the conference room, half a dozen executives milled around, each holding papers or tablets. They greeted Eric with a mix of confidence and subdued worry. Their eyes darted to Jacob, but no one questioned his presence. Eric introduced him simply. "This is Jacob, shadowing me today." Then the meeting began. Charts filled a large screen showing timelines, cost breakdowns, and risk factors. Jacob settled in a corner seat, hands folded, as terms like zoning approvals, contingency funds, and stakeholder buy-in bounced around. Despite the dryness of the subject, Jacob's gaze flickered back and forth, tracking the conversation. Eric led the discussion with a calm authority, asking pointed questions and deflecting panic, when one manager warned about a potential delay. An hour later, the meeting ended. As the others filed out, Eric exhaled, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. Jacob approached, brow furrowed. "I understood maybe half of that," he joked, "but it was interesting to see how you keep them all on track." Eric allowed a small laugh. "Half is better than zero. Most people outside the industry can't follow any of it. Maybe one day you'll pick up the rest." Jacob gave a crooked grin. "Maybe." They returned to Eric's office, where the clock showed it was nearing noon. "Hungry?" Eric asked, gathering some files to drop off before lunch. Jacob nodded, but before either could move, Dana stepped in again, her normally composed features slightly tense. "Mr. Lockwood, there's a Mr. Donnelly on line 3. He's calling from—" "Donnelly?" Eric cut in, flicking through mental connections. "I don't know a Donnelly." Dana paused. "He claims to be with Child Protective Services. Says it's urgent." At once, Eric's stomach knotted. He glanced at Jacob, whose face drained of color. "Put him through," Eric said, sliding into his chair. Jacob stood near the desk, hands clenched. A crisp male voice crackled through the speakerphone. "Mr. Lockwood, this is Thomas Donnelly from CPS. We've received some inquiries regarding a minor named Jacob Ross. He's been reported missing from foster care. I understand he's with you?" Ice crawled through Eric's veins. "Yes," he said, voice carefully controlled. "I'm aware he left his last placement. We're in the process of filing for guardianship. My lawyer can confirm." Donnelly's tone held a note of official caution. "I appreciate that. However, until the court finalizes everything, we have to verify Jacob's well-being. I'd like to arrange a home visit." Jacob tensed visibly, and Eric noticed the flicker of alarm in the boy's eyes. "A home visit," Eric repeated. "Fine, if that's required, but we're in compliance with all legal steps." Donnelly hesitated. "Of course, we just need to confirm living conditions and ensure Jacob's basic needs are being met. Let's set it up for tomorrow if possible." The call ended with an exchange of details, leaving the office in an uneasy hush. Jacob exhaled shakily, tension etched into every angle of his body. "This is going to mess it all up, isn't it?" Eric rose from his chair, moving to place a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "It won't," he said firmly. "We're doing everything right. They can't force you away if we're following the legal path. It's just procedure." Jacob's eyes glimmered with a mix of fear and defiance. "Okay," he whispered, as if trying to believe Eric's reassurance. Eric held his gaze. "We'll handle this together. I promise." Outside, the sun blazed high, its warmth filtered through glass and steel. Yet within that polished office, a chill lingered, an unwelcome reminder that the road to providing Jacob a permanent home might be more complicated than they'd first imagined. If you're invested in their journey, please like, share, and subscribe. They left the office shortly after Donnelly's call, both of them anxious for distance from the corporate walls that suddenly felt stifling. Eric had remained calm during the conversation, but inside his nerves jangled like loose wires. He could still see the look in Jacob's eyes, that flash of fear at the mere mention of a CPS home visit. They both understood how much power the system held. Even if everything was done by the book, the system could still complicate their lives. The sky was bright outside, yet a hush seemed to follow them as they descended to the lobby. Passing colleagues offered respectful greetings, and a few cast curious glances at Jacob. Sensing the boy's unease, Eric moved briskly across the polished floor. He simply wanted to get them both away from watchful eyes. Inside the waiting car, Jacob slumped in the seat, hands folded in his lap. The earlier curiosity he'd shown, shadowing Eric through meetings, marveling at the glass offices, had faded. Now he stared at nothing, brow furrowed in thought. Eric joined him, nodding at the driver to start toward the penthouse. "I'm sorry," Jacob muttered, his voice so soft Eric almost missed it. Eric turned to him. "For what?" Jacob shrugged, eyes still fixed on a point beyond the tinted window. "Because I didn't think. I just left foster care and now it might screw things up for you, for us. I keep feeling like a problem you have to solve." Eric's heart twisted. "Jacob, you are not a problem. CPS is just doing what they're supposed to, verifying you're safe." He tried to give a reassuring smile. "We have the documents. We have Miriam backing us up. This is just a hiccup." Jacob nodded slowly, but the tightness in his posture didn't relax. It took them nearly half an hour to navigate the midday traffic, horns blaring and taxis weaving in and out of lanes. The entire ride, a tense quiet hovered in the car. By the time they arrived at the high-rise, Eric could practically feel the relief seeping from both of them as they stepped into the private elevator. Back inside the penthouse, Jacob set his shopping bags on the sofa, his expression thoughtful. "When's this visit going to happen?" he asked at last. Eric loosened his tie and laid it on the kitchen counter. "Donnelly suggested tomorrow," he said. "We'll confirm a time. It shouldn't take long. He'll probably look around, ask us a few questions. Then he'll make a note that you're living in a stable environment." Jacob stuffed his hands into the pockets of his new jeans. "I know how it usually goes. The social worker checks if you have a bedroom, if there's food, if you're not, in danger. Then they quiz you in front of the adult." "Right," Eric agreed quietly. "But I'll be there, and I'll make sure you feel comfortable." He paused, noticing how tired Jacob looked. "Do you want to rest? I can handle lunch if you need a nap or some downtime." Jacob shrugged, heading over to the windows. "I'm all right." But he sank into an armchair, shoulders sagging. The tension in him was evident despite his attempt at composure. Eric watched him for a moment. He wished he could fix it all with a single promise, but he knew from their conversations that trust had to be earned day by day. "I'm going to make a quick call to Miriam," he said. "We'll figure out how to approach tomorrow. Then if you feel up to it, we could go for a walk or something, take our minds off this." Jacob nodded without comment, so Eric retreated to his office. With the door partially open, he dialed Miriam. She answered on the second ring. "Eric," she said in a brisk but friendly tone, "I heard from Donnelly. He gave me a heads up that CPS wants to pop by soon. I take it you're aware?" "Yes," Eric confirmed, leaning against his desk. "What should I expect? I don't want Jacob to feel ambushed." "Likely just a standard assessment," Miriam replied. "They'll note the environment, maybe check the bedroom. Donnelly might ask a few questions about your relationship, how long you've known each other, why Jacob left foster care. If everything aligns with the guardianship petition, it should be fine." Eric exhaled. "All right. Jacob is anxious, but I'll reassure him." "Good," Miriam said. Then her tone softened. "You're doing the right thing. Once we're through this, you'll be one step closer to providing him a permanent home." Eric thanked her and ended the call. Stepping out, he saw Jacob fiddling with his phone, probably an old device from a prior foster placement. He looked up, eyes half wary. "What did she say?" "That it's routine," Eric answered, walking over and sitting on the sofa across from the boy. "We just stay honest. Show him your room. If Donnelly sees that you're settled and safe, he'll report that to the court." Jacob flicked his gaze across the penthouse. "I guess it's pretty obvious I'm safe here," he muttered. "I just hate feeling like I can be taken away any time." Eric's stomach twisted at the thought. "You won't be," he said firmly. Let's do something normal to get our minds off it. A walk? Or we could go back to that community center, see if you want to explore any programs." Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "A walk might be okay." Within minutes, they left the penthouse. taking the elevator to the ground floor. The doorman greeted them with a polite nod, and they stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk. The sky remained clear and bright, a pleasant warmth in the late afternoon air. Cars streamed by in a steady flow, and pedestrians hurried about their business. Eric led them toward a nearby park, a smaller one tucked between tall office buildings, an urban oasis with winding paths and benches. They ambled side by side. Jacob studied the tidy flower beds and carefully trimmed shrubs. Despite the city's usual clamor, the park felt almost peaceful. After several minutes of companionable silence, Jacob turned to Eric. "I've been thinking about that community center you took me to. Maybe I should try a tutoring session. I'm behind in school, big time." Eric's face lit with relief. "That's great. We can arrange something soon. You'd have a chance to catch up before we figure out official school enrollment." Jacob nodded. "I don't like the idea of going back to a public school right away. Last time was not great. Too much moving around. And some of the kids, well, they knew I wasn't there for long. They'd call me the foster kid." His mouth twisted at the memory. Eric laid a hand gently on his shoulder as they strolled. "This time might be different," he said. "You'll be living in one place. You'll have the support you need. People can say whatever they want, but you know you have options now." Jacob tipped his head back, gazing at the skyscrapers that rimmed the park. "It's weird. Part of me wants to do everything at once. Figure out my education, sign up for those tutoring classes, get on track to graduate. The other part is scared to believe it'll last." Eric slowed his pace, turning toward the boy. "I understand, but we take it step by step. No one is going to rush you into anything." Jacob kicked at a stray pebble on the path. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. A breeze stirred the leaves, and they drifted onward until they reached a small fountain in the park's center, water splashing merrily against the stone. They paused there, each lost in thought. Eventually, they meandered back onto the sidewalks. Hungry by then, they stopped at a food cart advertising fresh lemonade and soft pretzels. Jacob's eyes lit up at the smell of salted dough, so Eric bought two. They carried their snacks as they walked, the city's hustle forming a comforting background hum. Back at the penthouse, the sun dipped behind distant towers, casting the living room in long shadows. Jacob retreated to his guest room, presumably to put away his new clothes. Meanwhile, Eric checked messages from work, noting a few urgent matters for tomorrow morning. He felt a twinge of guilt for leaving tasks half-finished, but everything else seemed secondary to ensuring Jacob felt secure. Before dinner, Eric tapped on Jacob's door. "I'm going to order in," he said, voice raised slightly to carry through the wood. "Anything you want?" Jacob opened the door, the hint of a smile curving his lips. "Chinese food, maybe? Haven't had that in forever." Eric grinned. "Coming right up." He turned away, relief surging in him at the normalcy of the exchange. Little gestures, choosing dinner, discussing preferences, told him they were forging a life that didn't revolve solely around crisis. They ate in the living room, containers spread across the coffee table. Jacob attacked his fried rice with surprising appetite. Between bites, they talked about small things, how the tutoring at the center might work, what subjects Jacob found toughest, whether or not they should get a pet someday. Eric teased that a dog might be good for them both, giving the place more warmth. Jacob's eyes sparked with genuine interest, though he kept his tone measured, only if you're sure you can handle the responsibility. They smiled over that, the tension from earlier receding. For once, the looming specter of CPS didn't hover in every corner. Still, after dinner, as Eric cleared the empty takeout boxes, Jacob's shoulders tightened. "I keep telling myself tomorrow will be fine," the boy admitted in a near whisper. "But it's hard not to remember all the times social workers came into my life and took me away." Eric pressed his lips together, then crossed the room to stand beside Jacob, who had slumped onto the sofa. He placed a hand on the boy's arm. "I can't pretend you haven't had it rough," he said softly, "but this time no one's going to whisk you off without cause. The minute Donnelly sees how we're living, that you have a proper bed, that you're not being neglected or harmed, he'll recognize this is the best place for you right now." Jacob stared at the floor. "Yeah," he breathed. "I guess I just have to trust it'll work out." Eric gave a small nod. "You've got me, you've got Miriam, and we have the law on our side. As long as we stay transparent, we'll handle whatever questions come our way, promise." Later that night, the penthouse settled into quiet. Eric strolled through the darkened rooms, flipping off lights and checking that Jacob's door was slightly ajar, a gesture the boy seemed to find reassuring. Finally, Eric stood by a window overlooking the city. Streetlights gleamed in geometric patterns, the noise of honking horns distant yet ever present. He found himself remembering Margaret's face, her confident smile, her unwavering eyes. Would she be proud of how he was stepping up, or sad that it had taken him this long to realize how important it was to care for someone beyond himself? He inhaled, letting the thought linger. Tomorrow, Child Protective Services would arrive, and Eric intended to face that challenge head-on. He tried to picture Donnelly touring the penthouse, checking the fridge, confirming a bedroom existed for Jacob. None of it was complicated, but so much was at stake. A single misstep could unravel the fragile sense of belonging Jacob had begun to embrace. Still, Eric refused to indulge doubt. He reminded himself that Miriam had already paved the legal road. He had a stable job, a safe home, and the resources to provide for Jacob's well-being. They would pass the inspection. Then they could move on to the next step, finalizing guardianship and giving Jacob a life he'd once believed impossible. With that silent vow, Eric turned away from the window, heading to his own room. He would need rest for tomorrow's test, even though he knew sleep might elude him. In the hallway's half-light, he paused, listening to the hush beyond Jacob's door. He wondered if the boy was awake, wrestling with fears of being uprooted yet again. Or perhaps he'd managed to find some measure of comfort in the knowledge that this time he wasn't alone in the fight. If you're continuing on this journey with Eric and Jacob, please like, share, and subscribe. The next morning arrived with a diffuse light that crept through the city's skyline, brushing the penthouse windows in gentle shades of pink and gold. Eric woke earlier than his alarm, already aware that this day carried weight. He lingered in bed for a few moments, absorbing the quiet and reminding himself that everything hinged on a smooth, straightforward visit from Thomas Donnelly of CPS. As he dressed, he could sense his own pulse beating faster than usual. Rationally, he knew there was nothing to hide, but in his gut, the mere presence of a government agency felt like a potential threat to Jacob's fragile new life. By the time he stepped into the kitchen, Jacob was already there. The boy clutched a glass of water, gaze distant. He wore one of his new hoodies, the dark gray fabric soft against his thin frame, and Eric noted that even though Jacob seemed calmer than he had been the evening before, a faint tension gripped his features. The air between them felt almost solemn, like they were bracing for a test neither had fully studied for. "Morning," Eric said gently, retrieving 2 bowls and a box of cereal from the cabinet. "You all right?" Jacob gave a small shrug. "Didn't sleep great. Kept thinking about that guy coming over." Eric nodded. "I understand, but remember, we've done nothing wrong. We'll show him you have a stable place here, we'll answer his questions, and that's it." Jacob stared at the kitchen island's marble surface. "Yeah," he murmured, "I'll try not to freak out." They ate in subdued silence, spoons clinking against ceramic. Outside, the city rumbled awake. Eric found himself glancing at the clock repeatedly, each minute feeling like it inched them closer to the inevitable knock at the door. He double-checked that the fridge was stocked, that Jacob's room looked lived in but tidy, and that all the documents Miriam had prepared were neatly arranged on the coffee table. Jacob hovered nearby, chewing his lip as Eric fussed, but he didn't protest. Perhaps busying themselves with small tasks offered some comfort. When the intercom finally buzzed, Eric felt a jolt shoot through him. He strode to the panel. A voice identified itself. Thomas Donnelly, Child Protective Services. Eric pressed the button to let him in, his heart thumping. Jacob stood stiffly by the sofa, eyes flicking toward the hallway as though he might bolt, but after a moment he lifted his chin and planted his feet. A few minutes later, Donnelly stepped through the penthouse door. He was taller than Eric had pictured, with thinning brown hair combed neatly to one side and a crisp button-down shirt tucked into gray slacks. A leather folder bulged under his arm. He offered a professional smile, not quite warm but not hostile either. "Thank you for having me on short notice," he said, nodding at Eric. Then he turned to Jacob, voice gentling. "Hello again, Jacob." Jacob gave a curt nod. "Hi." Eric extended his hand. "We appreciate your coming by. Please have a seat." He gestured to the sofa. Donnelly nodded, settling on the cushion. Jacob lowered himself into a nearby armchair, knees drawn together, while Eric perched on the edge of another seat, striving to project calm confidence. Donnelly retrieved a notepad from his folder. "I won't take too much of your time. As I mentioned, this is a routine welfare check. We received notice that Jacob was missing from his last foster placement, then discovered he's here under your care." His gaze swept the spacious living area. "I'm sure you understand we need to confirm he's safe, and that your guardianship petition is in good faith." Eric kept his voice even. "Yes, I do. We're working with Miriam Barlow, an attorney who filed the paperwork. We can provide any documentation you need." Donnelly nodded. "I have spoken with Ms. Barlow. Let's start with a brief overview. How did Jacob come to live with you?" Jacob shifted slightly, so Eric spoke first. "Jacob's mother was someone I cared for deeply. She passed away years ago. I only recently learned that Jacob had been in foster care, and after reconnecting at a cemetery, we realized he needed a stable environment." He paused, glancing at Jacob for confirmation. "He's been here since." Jacob cleared his throat. "I ran away from the foster home," he admitted, his voice tight. "It wasn't a good place. I'm not proud of taking off, but I had nowhere else. Eric's helping me." Donnelly scribbled notes, expression neutral. "So far, that lines up with what I've heard. Could I see where Jacob sleeps?" Eric stood, motioning for Donnelly to follow. Jacob rose as well, guiding the social worker down the hall toward his guest room. Eric hovered by the doorway as Donnelly stepped inside, scanning the neatly made bed, the small desk, the closet with new clothes. Jacob lingered by the window, letting Donnelly inspect the space without commentary. "It's comfortable," Donnelly said, glancing at Eric. "He has privacy, clothing, a proper bed, basic necessities, and from what I can see, this is a safe environment." "That's correct," Eric confirmed. "He's free to use any common areas, and he has full access to the kitchen. I don't lock him in or restrict him. We also have building security if needed." Donnelly nodded thoughtfully, returning to the living room. He sat again on the sofa, flipping through forms in his folder. Jacob retreated to the armchair, tension rippling in his posture. "Jacob," Donnelly said, turning to him, "do you feel you have what you need here? Food, a sense of stability, emotional support?" Jacob exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Yes," he said, voice trembling just a bit. "It's not something I'm used to, but Eric's been decent. I'm not scared. I'm not hungry." He glanced toward the wide windows, then back at Donnelly. "I want to stay." Donnelly jotted more notes. "Understood. Are you aware of the guardianship process Ms. Barlow initiated? Yes, Jacob replied. I've signed some forms. I'm okay with it. Donnelly nodded again, his manner calm. He shifted his attention to Eric. Do you have the means and willingness to provide long-term care, including medical coverage, education, and so forth? I assume your attorney has already indicated you do, but I'd like to hear it directly. Eric didn't hesitate. Absolutely. I run Lockwood Industries, a well-funded company. My insurance plan covers dependents, and I can ensure Jacob sees a doctor or dentist as needed. Regarding school, I'm working on enrolling him in a program or helping him catch up through a local community center. We're taking it step by step, but I won't let him slip through the cracks. Donnelly listened closely, tapping his pen lightly against the notepad. Everything sounds in order. My role is to confirm there's no neglect, abuse, or exploitation. That's certainly not the impression I'm getting. He paused. I do need to ask for the record. Does Jacob have any living relatives or a known father who might contest guardianship? Jacob stiffened, his face clouding. Eric placed a steady hand on the armrest, silently offering support. We have no indication of any father's involvement, Eric said firmly. His mother left no information regarding paternal rights. Donnelly observed Jacob's reaction, then drew a careful breath. All right, in that case, you'll likely proceed uncontested. If a father appears later, we'd reassess, but that's hypothetical. An uneasy hush settled. Eric knew the mention of a father still stung, a reminder of all the unanswered questions. He kept his expression neutral, unwilling to let the conversation derail. They had to finish this visit without raising alarms. Donnelly slid his notes back into the folder. I think I have what I need. I'll submit my report indicating that Jacob is in a stable, appropriate environment. The judge will see that, and likely no further action will be required beyond the usual court hearing for guardianship. Jacob's shoulders sagged in relief. Eric felt an echo of that in his own chest. Thank you, Eric said quietly. We appreciate it. Donnelly stood and smoothed his shirt. Jacob, if you ever need to reach me, here's my card. I'm required to give you an avenue in case circumstances change. He handed a simple white business card to Jacob, who took it, murmuring thanks. I'll see myself out. Eric and Jacob escorted him to the door. The moment it clicked shut behind him, Jacob exhaled a shaky laugh, pressing a hand to his forehead. That was so tense. I kept waiting for him to say something awful. Eric closed his eyes, relief surging through him. I know, but it went well, right? He glanced at Jacob. He seemed satisfied. Jacob nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a tentative smile. Yeah, I guess that's a good thing. They returned to the living room, both still rattled by adrenaline. Eric dropped onto the sofa, loosening the top button of his shirt. How about we take the rest of the day off from worrying about anything official? We could watch a movie, play a video game, whatever you like. We deserve a break. Jacob chuckled softly, sliding into the armchair. I could go for a movie, something loud and silly maybe. Eric grinned. Loud and silly it is. They set up the television and scrolled through streaming options. Jacob chose an over-the-top action flick, the kind with improbable stunts and explosions every few minutes. As the film roared to life on the screen, both of them found themselves immersed in the exaggerated world. It was a welcome distraction from the emotional roller coaster they'd been on. Midway through, Eric paused the movie to grab sodas and popcorn from the kitchen. He handed a bowl to Jacob, who thanked him, then stared at the swirling patterns on the container. You know, Jacob said, voice quieter now, I've never felt this safe. It's weird. I keep expecting it to vanish. Eric placed a careful hand on the boy's shoulder. It won't vanish, not if I can help it. One step at a time, remember? Jacob gave him a solemn look. Yeah, one step at a time. Then he clicked play, letting the fictional chaos of car chases and improbable rescues fill the penthouse with noise. They finished the movie, both laughing at the overblown finale, and Eric realized how long it had been since he'd let himself relax this much. Now, the weight in his chest felt lighter, as though the threat of losing Jacob had receded for the moment. The official system had peered into their world and found it acceptable. There were more steps ahead, but at least the first hurdle was cleared. When the credits rolled, Jacob stretched, then rose from the chair. "Thanks for that," he said, voice serious again. "I needed a break." Eric nodded. So did I. Outside, late afternoon sunshine poured through the windows, painting the city in amber tones. "Let's think about dinner soon. Italian? Or maybe we can cook together. Try something new." Jacob smiled, and in that simple gesture, Eric saw a flicker of hope that had been lacking the day before. "Let's cook," the boy decided. "I want to see if I remember how to make anything more complicated than eggs." Eric laughed. "That sounds like a plan. We'll create a masterpiece, or a disaster, but at least we'll do it together." They headed to the kitchen, scanning a recipe on Eric's tablet. As they rummaged for ingredients, the penthouse filled with the simple noise of normalcy: water running, cabinets opening, conversation overlapping. Tomorrow would bring new concerns, further legal steps, glimpses into an uncertain future. But for this afternoon, the present felt steady, like a puzzle gradually clicking into place. In Margaret's absence, Eric Lockwood and Jacob Ross were forging a bond neither had expected, one that might just heal old wounds and shape a brighter tomorrow. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe. Jacob woke the following morning to the hum of Eric pacing down the hallway, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. The faint smell of brewed coffee drifted beneath the closed door of the guest room, luring him to a new day. Glancing around the room, he reminded himself that this was real, that he was no longer waiting for the next disruption in some cramped foster placement. Instead, he had an entire day ahead in a penthouse where, for once, no caretaker had forced him out. He washed up, dressed in a t-shirt and jeans, then meandered into the kitchen. Eric paused mid-sentence when he saw Jacob, giving him a smile and a small wave to indicate he'd wrap up the call soon. The tension in Eric's voice suggested a business matter, something about a delay in negotiations for the East Coast expansion. Jacob settled on a stool, watching him calmly. Over the past week, he'd grown accustomed to glimpses of Eric's corporate life, hearing fragments of strategy calls that soared above his comprehension. But instead of feeling intimidated, he found it oddly reassuring to see how Eric handled crises with measured authority. When Eric hung up, he exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Sorry about that," he said, crossing to fill a mug with coffee. "Work never stops, especially when a major deal is on the line. How are you doing?" Jacob shrugged, reaching for an apple from the fruit bowl. "I'm good. It's weird not having to worry about where I'll be sleeping," he said softly. "I actually slept all night, no nightmares." Eric's expression brightened. "That's progress. Maybe we'll make a habit of normal living, with fewer nightmares. Also, Miriam called me late last night. She says the next court date might come sooner than expected. They're expediting certain guardianship cases to clear backlog, so we might have a hearing in 2 weeks." Jacob paused mid-bite. "Is that good?" "Potentially great," Eric replied, sipping his coffee. "If everything goes as planned, we'll have an official decision about guardianship soon. The earlier we finalize it, the better for you to move forward. School, health coverage, everything." He studied Jacob's reaction. "No pressure, of course, it's just a step in the process." Jacob set his apple aside. "No, that's good. I want it to be final. I just keep wondering if something will come along to ruin it." Eric nodded sympathetically. I know, but we've done everything right. CPS is satisfied and the judge typically sides with what's clearly best for you. He lowered his voice. I believe that means staying here with me. Jacob's cheeks tinged pink and he gave a slight nod. Yeah, he murmured. I believe that too. They continued their morning routine, Eric glancing periodically at the time. He planned on visiting the community center with Jacob that afternoon to discuss tutoring. Just as they were clearing breakfast dishes, Eric's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. The number was unknown. Hello? He said, pressing the phone to his ear. This is Eric Lockwood. Who's speaking? Jacob watched as Eric's posture stiffened. Eric's gaze settled on him, eyes widening slightly, and he swallowed. I see, he said into the phone, forcing composure. How did you get this number? After a pause, he inhaled slowly. All right, I'll consider your request. Yes, we can talk about it, but not over the phone. Yes, I'll bring him if he agrees. When Eric ended the call, Jacob frowned. Who was that? Eric hesitated, setting the phone aside. He appeared rattled in a way Jacob hadn't seen before. Jacob, he began carefully, that was someone named Richard Price. He's an associate of Mark Donovan. Jacob's brow furrowed, trying to place the name. Mark Donovan? Eric set down his coffee mug. I haven't mentioned him much, but he's a major player in the investment world. Ruthless, powerful, a person who can shift entire markets if he chooses. I've done business with him tangentially over the years, but we're not exactly friends. His voice slowed. Richard Price said Donovan has reason to believe that you might be his biological son. A ringing silence followed. Jacob stared, heart thudding. What? That's what Price claimed, Eric said. He wants a meeting. He asked if we'd sit down with Donovan in private. Says he has, evidence. I don't know how legitimate that might be, but apparently your mother once had ties to him, long before I even met her. Jacob's breath caught. Mom never mentioned any father. You think this is real, or is Donovan just stirring up trouble? Eric sighed. I'm not sure. Margaret didn't confide in me about her relationships before we dated. But Donovan's name never came up. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration emanating from every line of his posture. He must have found out recently. Maybe he did some investigating after hearing rumors that I took in Margaret's son. He's no stranger to invasive tactics. Jacob sank into a chair. So, if he's my father, does that mean he can take me away from here? The fear in the boy's eyes stung Eric's heart. Not automatically. He'd have to prove paternity and petition the court, showing it's in your best interest. You have a right to decide, too. You're old enough to express where you want to live. The courts weigh that heavily. Jacob's hands trembled in his lap. He never tried to find me before. Why now? Eric shook his head. Maybe he never knew you existed, or maybe he didn't care until he saw some advantage. Donovan is complicated. He glanced at his phone, mind churning. Price insisted we meet soon. I told him I wouldn't promise anything until I spoke with you. Jacob mulled this over, eyes darting anxiously. After a tense moment, he clenched his jaw. Fine, I'll hear him out. But I won't decide anything yet. I don't trust him. Eric felt a wash of relief that Jacob hadn't panicked. That's fair. We'll do it on our terms. I won't let Donovan corner you. We can see what he has to say, then talk with Miriam. Maybe it's just an empty claim. Jacob nodded, though the anxiety remained etched in his features. Let's get it over with soon so it's not hanging over us. Eric phoned Price back, setting up a meeting at a neutral private lounge in a reputable hotel for the following day. He insisted that any discussion remain civil, and that no immediate decisions be forced upon Jacob. Price sounded too eager, but he reluctantly agreed. The rest of the day blurred. They visited the community center as planned, where Jacob tentatively signed up for a math tutoring session. However, the new worry about Donovan's sudden claim loomed in every corner. Even while talking with volunteers, Eric caught the boy's eyes drifting toward faraway thoughts. By evening, the tension had turned them both quiet, each lost in speculation about the next day. Supper was a subdued affair. Pasta ordered from a local restaurant, eaten with minimal chatter. Jacob asked if Eric believed the claim. Eric wished he could be certain. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "But Donovan wouldn't approach us without reason. Let's keep our guard up." Jacob looked at the swirling sauce on his plate. "What if it's true, though? You've done everything for me. I don't want him just walking in and acting like he can claim me because of DNA." Eric clasped a hand around the boy's shoulder. "You're not a possession. If Donovan is your father, that doesn't erase what we've built. And the law respects your voice. You're not a small child." That night, Eric barely slept, imagining possible outcomes. He pictured Donovan, an imposing figure known for conquering boardrooms with cunning deals, suddenly fighting for custody of a teen he'd never raised. It felt surreal and ominous. Morning arrived too soon, overcast skies reflecting Eric's mood. He and Jacob prepared in near silence, each dressing more carefully than usual. Eric chose a tailored blazer, hoping a confident exterior might steady them both. Jacob wore his new jeans and a neat button-down, face pale but determined. They arrived at the hotel lounge a few minutes early. A quiet hostess escorted them to a reserved alcove with high-backed chairs. Jacob's eyes flickered anxiously around the softly lit space. Eric placed a steady hand on the boy's arm as they sat, scanning the entrance for Donovan. At exactly 10 o'clock, two men appeared. One had graying hair and a discreet manner, surely Richard Price. The other was tall, with an air of refined power, Mark Donovan. He wore a charcoal suit, his posture impeccable, and his gaze sharp as knives. The instant he spotted Jacob, something flickered in his expression. Perhaps recognition or a swirl of emotions he'd never learned to conceal. Donovan stepped forward, hand extended. "Eric," he said in a smooth baritone, "thank you for agreeing to meet. And you must be Jacob." Jacob's voice came out dry. "Yes." He didn't rise or offer a handshake, merely regarding Donovan warily. Donovan lowered his hand, nodded once, then took the seat across from them. Price settled beside him. A hush stretched. Finally, Donovan spoke. "I regret we have to do this under awkward circumstances, but I only recently discovered the possibility that Margaret Ross and I might have had a child. I was unaware." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "Unaware for 15 years? Seems like you didn't care to check." Donovan flinched. "I truly never knew. Margaret and I..." He paused, glancing at Eric as if uncertain how much detail to reveal. "Were involved before she met you, Eric. We parted on complicated terms. I heard she passed but never dreamed she was pregnant." Eric kept his tone even. "So what's your goal now?" Donovan exhaled. "I'd like a paternity test to confirm or refute my suspicion. If Jacob is indeed my son, we need to discuss his future." Jacob's hands balled into fists. "My future is with Eric," he said quietly. Jacob's words hung in the silent lounge, a quiet but fierce declaration that startled even Eric. Donovan's gaze flicked toward the clenched fists, an emotion stirring behind his cool composure. Price, seated beside him, cleared his throat, as though ready to moderate any looming confrontation. But Donovan only exhaled slowly, folding his hands atop the table. "I understand you've built a bond with Eric," he said, voice measured, "and I respect that you've endured difficult circumstances. But I have a right to know the truth. If Margaret and I share a son, it's not something I can ignore. He paused, glancing at Eric with guarded civility. I'm prepared to arrange a DNA test at my expense. No lawyers, no protracted legal fights, simply a medical confirmation. Jacob refused to look away. If the test says you're my father, then what? He demanded. I'm supposed to pack up and live in your penthouse? Pretend everything's fine? Donovan's expression tightened. You wouldn't be forced into anything. My intention isn't to rip you from a stable environment, especially if it's meeting your needs. His gaze swept across the lounge, subdued but earnest. I know my reputation might suggest otherwise, but there's no hidden angle. I need clarity. After that, we can figure out what kind of involvement, if any, I should have in your life. Eric, who had been monitoring the tense exchange, leaned forward. Jacob needs to be comfortable. First and foremost, if we do this test, we do it on neutral ground with no strings attached. Donovan's gaze flicked to Eric. Agreed. I'm not here to disrupt guardianship proceedings, but if I'm his father, I'd at least like the chance to speak with him directly outside of rumors and speculation. Jacob searched Donovan's face, wrestling with a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Margaret had never mentioned this man, yet here he was, claiming paternal rights. The swirl of betrayal and longing fought inside him. Part of him wanted to reject Donovan outright, while another part wondered if there was something to gain from hearing him out. Slowly, Jacob's hands unclenched. Fine, he said at last, voice hoarse. We can do the test, but I'm not making any promises beyond that. Donovan inclined his head, relief flickering in his eyes. Thank you, he said softly. They settled on a plan. Price would arrange an appointment at a reputable clinic, one known for handling discreet paternity matters. Eric insisted that Miriam be informed immediately, ensuring legal oversight. Jacob agreed to attend under Eric's supervision, refusing to be alone with Donovan until results were confirmed. After finalizing these details, Donovan stood, smoothing his immaculate suit jacket, his demeanor tinged with a new fragility. I appreciate your willingness, he told Jacob, voice subdued. I know I've come out of nowhere, and you have every right to be angry or suspicious. Jacob dipped his chin, offering no further words. Eric rose as well, offering a stiff nod to Donovan and Price before guiding Jacob toward the exit. Both sides parted with uneasy courtesy, each uncertain of the future. All the way home, Jacob stared out the car window, eyes locked on the shifting skyscrapers. Eric watched him in the rearview mirror, heart aching for the turmoil the boy must feel. At the penthouse, neither spoke until they stepped off the elevator. Then Jacob, voice hushed, said, "Thanks for having my back. I know you didn't have to do that." Eric turned, resting a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "We're in this together," he replied. "If the test proves Donovan is your father, it doesn't undo everything we've built. The court will still weigh your wishes, and I'm not going anywhere." Jacob swallowed, blinking rapidly as if warding off tears. I didn't expect him to be so normal, you know. I imagined some villain." Eric mustered a faint smile. "Mark Donovan is many things, ruthless in business, calculating, but he's not a cartoon villain. If he truly didn't know about you, this is probably jarring for him too. That said, we remain cautious." Over the next few days, phone calls and texts flew between Price, Miriam, and the clinic. Eventually, an appointment was set for a Saturday morning. Jacob quietly braced himself. Despite Eric's attempts to distract him with outings, the boy grew introspective, slipping into long stretches of silence. Every so often Eric would find him perched by the window, gazing at the city with that worried furrow in his brow, as though scanning for answers in the skyline. Eric understood. The possibility of a father reappearing was a haunting prospect. When Saturday arrived, they drove to the discreet clinic on a tree-lined street near the city's edge. Donovan and Price were already waiting in the lobby. A sympathetic nurse guided Jacob and Donovan into separate rooms for cheek swabs, ensuring no direct confrontation overshadowed the procedure. Eric lingered in the hallway, tension gripping him like a vice. The process was quick, clinical, lacking any of the emotional weight swirling through their minds. By the time Jacob emerged, his features were pale but composed, a mixture of resignation and defiance. Donovan approached, a flicker of fatherly concern in his gaze. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice low. "I know this is difficult." Jacob only nodded, stepping closer to Eric. With no further exchange, they parted ways, left to wait for lab results. The lab promised answers within a week. In the meantime, life continued in a tense limbo. Eric threw himself into finalizing his guardianship hearing, collecting references and financial statements to prove he could provide for Jacob. The boy, meanwhile, attended a few tutoring sessions at the community center, forging small connections with other teens who had faced obstacles in their education. Slowly, Jacob's posture eased, and he began sharing glimpses of his day, like how he solved a tricky math problem or laughed at a volunteer's joke. Yet whenever the subject of Donovan arose, a shadow returned to his eyes. Each night, as the city lights glowed beneath the penthouse windows, Eric watched Jacob wrestle with the mounting questions. What if Donovan truly was his father? Could it change everything? Finally, the day arrived. Price phoned early in the morning, voice subdued, requesting a meeting to share the lab results in person. Eric and Jacob, hearts pounding, agreed to meet at the same hotel lounge. This time, they arrived to find Donovan already seated, a sealed envelope in front of him. He looked up when Jacob entered, uncertainty etched on his features. "Hello," he said, sliding the envelope forward. Price hovered at his elbow, similarly tense. "The results came in last night." Eric steeled himself, eyes flicking to Jacob. The boy took a seat, lips pressed together. Donovan inhaled sharply, as though fortifying himself. Then he opened the envelope, pulling out a short document. "It's positive," he announced, voice thick with a mix of awe and sorrow. "I'm your father." A fraught silence followed, pressing on them like a physical weight. Jacob's mouth parted, but words refused to form. Donovan swallowed, setting the document aside. "I know I can't fix lost years," he said haltingly, "but if you'll let me, I'd like the chance to know you." He paused, eyes earnest. "I'm not here to tear you from Eric. I see he's cared for you. I just want to be part of your life, whatever that means." Eric, feeling the sting of complicated relief, gently touched Jacob's arm. The boy blinked, tears brimming at the edges of his eyes. I don't want to leave Eric," he finally managed. "I want to live with him." Donovan nodded slowly, voice subdued. "I respect that. Maybe we can figure out visits, calls, something." In the hush that followed, relief warred with heartbreak. But for Jacob, a step forward had emerged, a father he never knew and a guardian who had fought for him. As they left the lounge, the uncertain future held two truths. He truly was wanted, and he would never stand alone again.